In June 1940, as the world was already burning from the fires of war, a new threat stirred beneath the calm blue waters of the Mediterranean. Italy had just entered World War II on the side of Nazi Germany. While Mussolini's speeches promised lightning victories and a revived Roman Empire, another quieter force prepared to fight its own kind of war, unseen, unheard, and deadly. They were the submarines of the Regia Marina, Italy's Royal Navy. To many in London, these vessels seemed like a secondary threat, perhaps even obsolete compared to the German U-boats ravaging the Atlantic. But those early assumptions would prove dangerously wrong. In the first months of Italy's war at sea, British convoys sailing to Malta, Alexandria, and the Suez Canal began disappearing without warning. Reports came in of torpedoes striking in daylight, of ships split in two by invisible attackers. The Royal Navy, confident in its Mediterranean dominance, suddenly realized it was being hunted. The Italian submariners were not amateurs. Many had trained for years in the clear, deceptive waters of the Tyrrhenian and Ionian seas. They had mastered stealth in environments where visibility was high and margins for error small. They knew how to use the glare of sunlight, the currents between Sicily and North Africa, and the deep shadows off Crete and Sardinia to their advantage. What began as scattered successes soon became a campaign that would haunt the Royal Navy's convoys for years. A campaign so effective that British sailors began calling the central Mediterranean the submarine graveyard. Italy's fascination with undersea warfare began long before the Second World War. By the 1930s, the Regia Marina possessed one of the largest submarine fleets in the world, over 100 vessels of various classes. Some were coastal defence boats, others long-range oceanic designs capable of reaching the Red Sea or even the Atlantic. Italian naval engineers had designed elegant yet complex submarines, often with luxurious interiors for long deployments, but also with fragile mechanical systems. While the Germans emphasized rugged efficiency, Italian designs emphasized range and comfort, reflecting Mussolini's dream of a Mediterranean empire. At the outbreak of war, these submarines were divided into two main fleets. The Mediterranean Command, operating from bases in Taranto, Cagliari, and Tobruk. The Atlantic Command, which would later establish its base in Bordeaux, under the name Betasum, a joint Italo-German submarine flotilla operating against Allied convoys from the Bay of Biscay. The officers were often career men from aristocratic families, highly educated, disciplined, and deeply patriotic. They saw themselves as the heirs to a proud naval tradition. Among them were names that would become legends in Italy but remain little known abroad. Carlo Feccia di Cossato, Primo Longobardo, Gianfranco Gazzana Priaroggia, commanders whose skill would rival that of Germany's most famous U-boat aces. When war began, Mussolini ordered his admirals to strike swiftly, to prove that Italy could dominate the Mediterranean. Within days, the Regia Marina's submarines were already on the hunt. Benito Mussolini believed the Mediterranean should be Mare Nostrum, our sea, a Roman echo of imperial dominance. He saw the British presence in Malta, Gibraltar, and Egypt as intolerable intrusions. In his mind, sinking British ships would be not just a military act, but a statement of national destiny. The early months of the war offered Italy an opportunity. France had fallen, the British Empire stood isolated, and the Royal Navy had to stretch its resources across multiple oceans. The Mediterranean suddenly became a high-stakes chessboard, and the Italian submarines were the pawns that could strike like queens. The first major successes came within weeks. The submarine Dandolo sank two merchant ships near Crete. Galileo Ferraris torpedoed a British cruiser off Tobruk. The Toti, operating in the Ionian Sea, ambushed a convoy and sent 3 transports to the bottom. By September 1940, British naval intelligence was alarmed. The Admiralty's reports noted unprecedented losses in the central Mediterranean and admitted that Italian undersea craft are more active and aggressive than previously assumed. Mussolini, ever eager for glory, exaggerated the victories in propaganda broadcasts. But beneath the boasting, something real was happening. Italy had found in its submarine crews a level of skill and courage unmatched in its surface navy. One of the most famous encounters took place on August 19, 1940. The Italian submarine Axum, commanded by Lieutenant Renato Farini, was patrolling north of Benghazi when its sonar picked up a large convoy, escorted, heavily armed, and steaming for Malta. Farini knew he had only minutes to decide. He waited, engines silent, as the silhouettes of destroyers crossed the horizon. Then he fired a spread of torpedoes and immediately dove deep. Moments later, the sea erupted. 3 British ships, including the cruiser HMS Manchester, were struck. The Manchester was severely damaged. 2 merchant ships were sunk outright. The British escorts dropped depth charges, but Farini slipped away into the dark. When Axum surfaced hours later, the crew could see oil fires burning across the horizon. They had struck a powerful fleet and escaped alive. For the Royal Navy, it was a warning. The Italian subs were not to be underestimated. The Axum's attack echoed across both navies. In London, the Admiralty increased anti-submarine patrols, diverting resources from the Atlantic. In Rome, Farini was celebrated as a hero. But behind the triumph lay a harsh reality. For every successful strike, another submarine was lost. The Mediterranean was narrow, the water clear, and British radar and sonar were improving rapidly. Still, the psychological damage was done. British sailors began calling the night sea Farini's water. By late 1941, the Italian submarine campaign had expanded far beyond the Mediterranean. The Betasum base in Bordeaux, established in collaboration with the German Kriegsmarine, became a launch point for Italian long-range subs in the Atlantic. From there, Italian commanders began striking Allied convoys bound for Britain and North Africa. Some even ventured as far as the coast of Brazil and West Africa. These missions were perilous. The Atlantic was cold, the Allied air patrols relentless, but they brought Italy into the global U-boat war. One of the most successful Italian aces of this phase was Carlo Feccia di Cossato, commander of the submarine Tazzoli. Between 1940 and 1943, he sank over 120,000 tons of enemy shipping, including tankers, troopships, and cargo vessels. His attacks were precise and daring, often surfacing at night to finish off crippled ships with his deck gun. The British press rarely mentioned these losses, but within the Admiralty, alarm grew. The Regia Marina's submarines, once dismissed as Mediterranean toys, had proven themselves capable of operating on par with Germany's best. The Royal Navy began reinforcing convoy escorts, rerouting supply lines, and accelerating sonar technology development. The very fear that Italian submarines instilled, the uncertainty of where or when they would strike, forced the British to change their entire naval strategy in southern waters. The Mediterranean, once called Britain's internal lake, had become a killing ground. By early 1941, the Regia Marina's undersea fleet had proved its worth in the confined Mediterranean. Yet Mussolini wanted more. He wanted Italy to be seen as an equal partner in Hitler's war at sea. Germany's Kriegsmarine, bloodied but respected, was already waging a massive campaign in the Atlantic. Dozens of U-boats prowled the shipping lanes between North America and Britain. The Germans, impressed by Italy's submarine production, saw an opportunity. Italian boats could extend their reach. And so began one of the lesser-known alliances of the war. a collaboration that would send Italian crews far from home to the cold and stormy Atlantic under a joint command known as Betasum. The name came from B for Bordeaux, Eta for the Italian letter E, and Som for Sommergibili, meaning submarines. It was more than a base, it was a symbol of Axis unity beneath the sea. When the first Italian subs sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, many of their crew had never seen the ocean beyond the Mediterranean. They were used to warm waters and short patrols. Now they faced weeks of crushing waves, freezing temperatures, and Allied air patrols that could spot a periscope from miles away. The Germans viewed their new partners with cautious respect. Italian subs were larger and more comfortable, but slower to dive and easier to detect. Training began immediately. Tactics, radio procedures, wolf pack coordination. Within months, Italian submarines began patrolling alongside German U-boats off the coast of Portugal and down toward West Africa. What followed was a period of both cooperation and rivalry, a race for tonnage, prestige, and survival. Bordeaux, on France's Atlantic coast, became Italy's window to the wider world. The Germans had handed over several submarine pens there after the fall of France, and the Italians transformed them into a fortified base. Concrete walls more than 3 meters thick protected dry docks, workshops, and barracks for over 2,000 sailors. From this stronghold, the Italian Atlantic Command, officially under Rear Admiral Angelo Perona, coordinated dozens of patrols stretching from Ireland to the Cape Verde Islands. Life at Betasum was hard, but strangely luxurious compared to front-line conditions. Italian crews brought their culture with them: espresso machines, tricolour flags, even opera music broadcast on weekends. Yet beneath the charm lay exhaustion. Every departure might be their last. When a submarine returned, the men were met by naval bands and the scent of diesel oil. Each patrol report was read aloud in the mess hall. Names of lost boats were carved into the concrete walls, a growing list that turned the base into both fortress and tomb. By mid-1942, 32 Italian submarines operated from Betasum. They had sunk more than 500,000 tons of Allied shipping, a figure that stunned even the Germans. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, visited the base personally and praised their Latin courage. But that praise carried a shadow. The Atlantic was changing. The Allies were learning faster than the Axis could adapt. Among all the Italian commanders, few were as feared by the Royal Navy as Carlo Feccia di Cossato. Elegant, soft-spoken, and utterly ruthless in combat, he commanded the submarine Tazzoli, named after an Italian priest executed for resisting the Austrians a century earlier. Between 1940 and 1943, Tazzoli became a legend. Operating first off West Africa and later in the Caribbean, Feccia di Cossato's crew hunted convoys with surgical precision. They tracked targets by moonlight, fired single torpedoes from improbable distances, and slipped away before escorts could react. On one patrol, Tazzoli sank 6 ships in 10 days. Another ace, Gianfranco Gazzana Priaroggia, commanded the Leonardo da Vinci. His submarine would go on to sink more than 120,000 tons, more than any other Italian boat and more than most German U-boats. Gazzana's methods were unorthodox. He preferred to strike at night, surfacing to fire torpedoes by sight alone. His last transmission before being lost in 1943 simply read, "Long live Italy." Other captains joined the pantheon: Primo Longobardo of the Tarantini, Vittorio Manini of the Finzi. Their combined successes forced the Royal Navy to reroute entire convoys through longer, safer paths, costing Britain fuel, time, and lives. The Italians had achieved what few thought possible: They had taken the fight from the Mediterranean's shallow seas to the vastness of the Atlantic, and for a brief moment they were winning. But triumph at sea was fleeting. The Atlantic was merciless, and Allied technology was evolving. New radar systems, sonar arrays, and long-range patrol bombers began closing the deadly gap between air coverage zones. What had once been a safe hunting ground became a death trap. The submarine Tazzoli disappeared in May 1943, likely destroyed by depth charges off the Azores. No distress call was ever heard. Vecchia di Cossato survived only to see Italy sign an armistice months later. Unable to reconcile with surrender, he would take his own life in 1944. The Leonardo da Vinci, pride of Betasum, met a similar fate. After sinking 3 more ships near the coast of Sierra Leone, she was ambushed and sunk by British destroyers. All 70 men aboard were lost. The Royal Navy, too, paid heavily. Dozens of destroyers and corvettes were diverted from the North Atlantic to guard southern routes. The psychological effect of Italian submarines was immense. British sailors spoke of them in hushed tones, describing torpedoes that came out of nowhere, and periscopes glimpsed seconds before explosions. For every ship sunk, Italy lost another boat, but the balance of fear lingered. By mid-1943, Betasum had sent 40 submarines to sea. 25 never returned. By the summer of 1943, the Axis position in the Mediterranean had collapsed. North Africa was lost, Sicily was invaded, and Italy's cities burned under Allied bombs. Betasum, once a proud symbol of fascist ambition, was now a relic. When Italy signed its armistice in September 1943, the men at Bordeaux faced an impossible choice. Some surrendered their boats to the Allies, others scuttled them to prevent capture. A few, unwilling to yield, joined German command under the puppet Repubblica di Salo. The base itself was seized by the Germans, then destroyed by Allied air raids the following year. The surviving submariners, many captured or interned, faded into obscurity. When the war ended, their names were barely mentioned in post-war histories. Italy wanted to forget fascism, and in doing so it forgot the men who had fought beneath the sea. Yet among naval historians, their impact remained undeniable. Between 1940 and 1943, Italian submarines sank more than 1 million tons of Allied shipping, a record surpassed only by Germany and the United States. They had forced Britain to change its entire convoy system, tied down escort fleets, and brought the war to every corner of the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Their courage was unquestionable. Their story nearly lost. In the summer of 1943, Italy's empire, the one Mussolini had promised would rival Rome, was falling apart piece by piece. Allied troops had landed in Sicily. The skies above Naples and Rome were filled with bombers. The Mediterranean, once declared Mare Nostrum, was now dominated by Allied warships. For the men of the Regia Marina, the end came not with explosions, but confusion. Orders arrived by radio, fragmented, contradictory, desperate. Some submarines at sea were told to continue fighting. Others were instructed to surrender to the Allies immediately. Admirals who had spent years fighting for fascist glory suddenly found themselves without a nation to serve. Crews wept as they destroyed their own boats, setting demolition charges in the torpedo rooms, flooding the ballast tanks, opening the sea valves by hand. The Betasum base in Bordeaux, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a ghost town. In early September 1943, word of Italy's armistice spread through its concrete tunnels. The men were stunned. Some threw down their insignia. Others vowed to keep fighting alongside the Germans. A handful of submarines attempted to flee to Allied ports, chased by German patrols. Many were sunk en route, attacked by their former comrades. The ocean that had once united them now became their grave. The submarine Luigi Torelli, one of the most travelled Italian boats, faced that very dilemma. Having operated from Betasum since 1940, she had crossed the Atlantic more than a dozen times, sinking ships from Africa to Brazil. When Italy surrendered, Torelli was at sea, low on fuel, unsure who to trust. She sought refuge first in neutral Spain, then attempted to reach Japan, joining Axis forces in the Pacific. Her voyage became legendary. She was captured by the Germans, handed over to Japan, and continued fighting under 3 flags, Italian, German, and Japanese, until 1945. Her story reflected the chaos of Italy's final years. A nation divided, yet unwilling to surrender its pride. For others, like the submarine Bryn in the Mediterranean, the armistice was a quiet tragedy. Her captain, unwilling to hand over his vessel, scuttled her off Taranto. As she sank, crewmen stood on deck and saluted, tears streaming down their faces. Across the Italian Navy, similar acts of defiance played out. Between September and October 1943, more than 30 submarines were destroyed by their own hands. They preferred the deep to dishonour. The British, witnessing these scenes, were conflicted. They had feared these submarines, fought them, hunted them, and yet, in their destruction, saw the same code of naval honour they held themselves. In the words of one Royal Navy officer who observed the surrender at Malta, "They came in proudly, flags lowered but not broken. They were beaten, yes, but not defeated in spirit." When the war ended in 1945, Italy lay devastated. Its cities were in ruins, its colonies gone, its people divided between shame and survival. The men of the submarine service returned home to no parades, no medals, no recognition. Many of them were branded as remnants of fascism and quietly dismissed from the new navy. Their records were sealed. For decades, their deeds went unspoken in classrooms, documentaries, and newspapers. Even within Italy, the stories of aces like Fecia di Cossato or Gazzana Priarogia faded into whispers, their names barely mentioned in post-war textbooks. But among naval historians and veterans, the memory persisted. Allied officers who had faced them at sea described their discipline with respect. British convoy commanders often admitted, years later, that Italian submarines were as formidable as any German boat. In 1950, the British Admiralty released a declassified report estimating that Italian submarines had sunk nearly 1.3 million tons of Allied shipping during the war, a figure that surprised even the Italians themselves. Yet the story remained largely absent from mainstream history. While Germany's U-boats became the focus of countless films and books, Italy's ghost fleet sank into obscurity. The men who had once terrified the Royal Navy simply vanished from public memory. It would take nearly half a century for their story to resurface. In the 1980s, Italian historians began revisiting wartime naval records, uncovering forgotten logs and patrol diaries. Among the most haunting finds were the final radio messages of the submarine Leonardo da Vinci transmitted just days before her loss. "Enemy ships sighted. Will attack at dawn. May God protect Italy." In 1999, divers off the coast of West Africa discovered what they believed to be the wreck of the Da Vinci, lying silent and intact on the seabed, torpedo tubes still loaded. It had become a time capsule, frozen at the moment of her death. Maritime museums in Rome, La Spezia, and Taranto began curating exhibitions about Italy's undersea war. Families of lost sailors donated photographs, uniforms, and letters home. One display case held a worn, leather-bound notebook belonging to an engineer from the Tazzoli. Inside were his final words, written on the eve of his last patrol. We will not return, but the sea will remember our names. For many Italians, these rediscoveries were a revelation, a chance to reclaim a part of their history that politics had buried. Today, the story of Italy's submariners stands as a reminder of courage and contradiction, of men who fought for a flawed cause, but did so with unmatched skill and bravery. In the annals of naval warfare, their record is staggering. Between 1940 and 1943, the Regia Marina's submarine fleet conducted over 1,000 patrols, sank more than 200 Allied ships, operated across the Mediterranean, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans, and held the third highest tonnage total of any nation in World War II. Yet their names are still missing from most history books. Perhaps because their story does not fit easily into the narrative of victory and defeat. It is instead a story of endurance, skill, and forgotten humanity. Every year on November 12th, Italy observes the Giornata del Marinaio Caduto in Mare, the day of the sailor lost at sea. At Taranto, veterans gather near the submarine memorial, where bronze plaques bear the names of every lost crew. When the ceremony ends, a single bell rings, one chime for each sunken submarine. Those who hear it say the sound seems to echo across the harbour, fading into the horizon like a voice from the deep. And somewhere, perhaps, the ghosts of the Tazzoli, Da Vinci, and Axum still patrol beneath the waves, silent witnesses to a war that tried to forget them. We fought for Italy, not for fascism. The sea knows who we were. Inscription on a memorial at La Spezia Naval Cemetery. Their war was not glorious nor victorious, but it was real, and it mattered. The Italian submarines struck fear into one of the greatest navies in history. And though history forgot them for a time, the sea never did.